You're watching a Decentered Media Talk with me, Rob Watson. Conversations about community media. Visit decentered.co.uk or follow on Instagram and Twitter at Decentered Media. Hello, welcome to another Decentered Media Talk. I'm Rob Watson, and this week, or this session, is about international community media. And what I want to do is just kind of cover some general topics that are associated with what's known as the UNESCO model of community media, which is about development and engagement, voice empowerment. Go through this in detail in the talk. As ever, the slides will be available, and a transcription of what I discuss will be available, and the notes with the links. So you don't need to worry too much about what's flashed up on the screen. Some of it, there's a lot of slides, and I think I may skip a couple of them or just show them briefly. But the source material that the slides relate to is going to be in the handout and the notes. So, it's very useful to look at. In fact, it's essential to look at the international context for community media, because it really is what defines community media within, or should define community media within the UK. There's a lot that we can learn from how community media is practiced internationally that would be of relevance to us here back in the United Kingdom. So let's share the screen. And if I can, it's the first week after the Christmas break. Share sound, optimize clip for video, and there we go. Okay, so kind of the idea of community media, as we've established, is that it is very local to people's experiences, but there's also an element which is international and global. And we want to think about community media from the perspective that we are in a community of practitioners and people who have very similar ideas and very similar expectations, and that we're not just working on our project alone, and we're not just undertaking our practices, or talking with our friends, colleagues, neighbours, people that we share our community or share our identity with. Is that actually that extends right the way across the world, and there's lots of people do this. And as we've discussed in previous talks, the idea that community media offers us a different space outside of professionalized corporate mass communications models of media. Although it might have some of the characteristics of that, it isn't driven by that. There's a fundamental different set of processes and motivations that drive community media in different ways. So we want to be thinking how and why community media is prevalent and is capable of being part of a wider dialogue. I'll start off by playing a short clip from a video. You might remember Carl Sagan did a thing when the Voyager satellites were launched to explore the solar system and beyond now, called the pale blue dot. And this is a version of that. The link to the video is in the notes.
From this distant vantage point, the Earth might not seem of any particular interest. But for us, it's different. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit? Yes. Settle? Not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known.
Okay, so it's a perspective which informs us that our individual and our group experiences and needs and drives maybe have to be seen in a wider context. And what we share and what we have in common is perhaps something that we should value more. And as these capabilities to communicate spread around the world, are we heading for more antagonism and division, or are we heading toward more understanding and a greater sense of unity? And this is an ongoing debate and discussion. I wouldn't want to be naive about it, and there are real differences that we maybe can't share, but we need to think about and accommodate and understand and incorporate. And there are real similarities that we fail to notice sometimes. So community media for me is really one of those, is a practice where we are starting to engage with one another and to build a confidence to communicate about our experiences and about who we are as people as individuals, as groups, as communities, which isn't told about us, but it's us telling our own stories about ourselves. So that's the kind of tenor of what we'll cover in the next hour or so, looking at some of these ideas of how this is practiced internationally. But what we've established previously is that community media is this practice with a kind of common set of aims, processes, and motivations, and that they're based around a set of ideas which haven't just come from nowhere. They're not just kind of they've if you like, they've sprung up independently and taken root independently, and seem like a good idea to lots of different people acting independently, rather than there's no central focus for this. There's no central organization for this. It's been collated and collected and is recognized. And that kind of shared practice is something that there's a commonality there, that people engage with each other on the basis that they agree around a set of development principles for community media, regardless of social and economic positions of the people involved, regardless of the geographic locations, regardless of the political stances, regardless of the cultures of the people involved. These things are important, but it offers us something which, if you like, gives us the chance to explore these ideas and these issues in a bit more detail and a bit more kind of integrated way with one another. So what are these principles? Well, according to Ali Rennie, community media is typically not for profit, although there might be some profit basis in this. But it's really about engaging people in the community to engage and participate in the production process of creating media, sharing media, to tell stories, to hold discussions, to engage with one another through a variety of different media platforms. So I'm agnostic about which platforms people use. It doesn't matter to me, whether it's radio, whether it's gaming, whether it's graphic design, whether it's data management, that it can be used for community benefit and social gain. Then there's something good about that. But also that we go beyond what is regarded as audiences, simply seeing people as audiences, people who only receive content, and thinking about communities of participants within the communications process more generally. So for me, community media is about developing communities, not about developing audiences. So because it rests on this idea, which Rennie goes on to talk about, this articulation of citizenship, this idea that democracy and equality are a viable outcome from our civic engagement, discussions, and deliberations, and that what we aim to achieve is a kind of inclusive and pluralistic set of relationships, which, yes, they do tell us a lot about our different subject positions, but they also tell us a lot about our social relations as well. So we can map out a lot of really interesting stuff about who we are and what we are by paying attention to how community media is practiced and what it offers to people and how it engages with people. What I would say is that a lot of this is quite fragile. There's very little investment goes into it, certainly in the UK, and it can be easily swamped. It can be easily pushed aside by the large corporate commercial interests and the governmental interests. So it's not something which has a solid foundation. It isn't a kind of an integrated living practice. And indeed, many people who deal with communications that are in some way community related don't practice or use these kind of models in order to engage people. And it's quite a separation, that the centralized production process for audiences, the mass media model, is still prevalent, whereas we're talking about a social engagement process, about access, about citizenship, about deliberation, about self-representation, the things that really matter. So community radio is a kind of global network. And there's we can look around the world at different practices, and one of the terms that is associated with this kind of internationalized form is the recognition of indigenous media. So media that is produced by people which is indigenous to the culture and the people who live in a particular area, and it's based around identity of if you think of First Nations groups, so in North America, Canada, that kind of place, in Australia, Australasia, the First Nations groups being able to represent themselves and to build up a way of communicating which isn't just scattered, which isn't just done to them or scattered sporadically, but it is something which can be consistently defined and channeled into something which is meaningful. So that what you end up with is this kind of push and pull, and we, it's the cliche, isn't it? Of think local, act global, or is it think global, act local? Glocal, I saw it described recently. So, where do we fit with that? We're part of an interconnected, mediated global village, and yet what matters to us is our local reference points and the way that we form our identity and articulate our experiences where we are and who we're with now. The kind of pull of globalized branding isn't the only way that we will achieve globalization, but that's maybe a conversation for another discussion. But the idea is, kind of globalized media and thereby community media is not only defined by place-based experiences, but it's also defined by a set of values. And these are articulated through different cultures and different languages and different symbolic traditions. And the danger is that we all imitate a model of communication that is mid-Atlantic. The American model of radio is something which is imitated around the world, and yet it's you've got to ask the question: what's its relevance to places other than the United States? I mean, what's the relevance to places within the United States is the obvious question. And is this kind of regurgitated facile kind of model of communications that is driven by corporate interests and corporate patterns of perception and engagement and motivation that are profit related, that there's space outside of that for us to articulate and develop a voice which is relevant to and meaningful to us in different ways. So we have to approach our sense of understanding about international community media in a number of different ways, and it's useful to look at how issues about sustainable development are articulated. Again, the links for these presentations, these videos, I'll only play a small component of it, but the links are available in the notes.
The challenges that face humanity now as a result of our unsustainable practices are manifold. You have rising sea levels, melting ice caps, and it's not only environmental, it's also social. A system which allows the rich to gain in wealth off the backs of the poor is unsustainable just as much as a new coal plant in an already polluted area. And this is why sustainable development as a definition has really grown in terms of its scope. Well, sustainable development has a rather short history. In the lead up to a conference in Stockholm, Sweden in 1972, the developing countries were saying, how can you prevent us from developing as these other nations have by restricting our access to environmental resources or polluting and things of this nature? Whereas the developed countries were doing the opposite. They were saying, you must restrict the resources you're using in the process of your development. And out of this kind of disagreement was born the concept of sustainable development.
At the heart of all the debates at the UN right now, most of the so-called developing countries are asking for the chance to be able to develop themselves, to have a certain lifestyle that they see that others are having. And some of the very difficult questions to answer will be, how can developing countries have the opportunity to do so by putting the climate more at risk? And what will be the responsibility of the developed countries who are responsible for the current situation in the first place? And it's a very, very tense issue because it talks about who's accountable, who's to pay for the future transition, who's going to help the developing countries become so-called developed.
It's a definition that has evolved and become richer over the years. In general, sustainable development is about the relationships that the countries and the peoples of the world have to one another.
It's still a very I versus you, us versus them kind of a discourse. And because of the trying to protect your own turf or your sovereignty, we're not actually trying to move ahead together as one global family.
Okay, so that's the deeper view of what is actually happening on the pale blue dot. You know, we've had the macro view of the extended cosmos, and this is a view that brings us very much deep into the question of how do we manage ourselves, our communities, our access to resources in a way which is sustainable and equitable and inclusive, rather than being driven by particular private interests which are exclusive. And you know, how do we bump along together is an age-old question. And my argument, and I think generally the idea that community media proposes, is that in order for this conversation to take place, we must have a media ecosystem that is sustainable itself, is inclusive itself, and enables people and empowers people to take part in these discussions and debates themselves, rather than it just being something which is done to them. And I think the logic and the argument of sustainable development approaches where the developed nations impose their will, if you like, on developing nations is anachronistic now, and that actually the groupings of nations who would wish to seek their further sustainable development for themselves is shifting as we gain just as time goes on, really. So that those kind of international relationships, and we saw this in relation to COP26 recently, that it's not just a simple way of kind of, we will provide, we're the rich nations, we know best, we will provide for you. But it's about building up capabilities, it's about building up skills, it's about engaging people to learn and grow and prosper, to produce their own plans for development, and not to have that imposed on people. And they will be different, having the space for it to be different. But we're a long way from that being practiced fairly and widely understood. And one of the the indicators of the fragility of the interrelationships between nations and communities is the kind of the status of refugees around the world. It's a barometer of what the kind of challenges are in relocating and building support for and access to resources for people who are subject to displacement. And that might be economic, it might be due to conflict, it might be due to famine. There's a whole range of reasons that, economic displacement happens. And, how do we understand that process without simply becoming paranoid or nervous, or that it would, it would be undertaken in such a way that it's a threat to social existence in established communities. These are real tensions that need to be understood, and merely playing these things out in an antagonistic way through mainstream media is really not good enough. We've seen this, the kind of Trumpian model of kind of build the wall, exclude people, treat South Americans as second-class people, and to protect your own. So you develop this chauvinistic response to international cooperation. And that just, we see this now played out in the UK with desperate people attempting to cross the English Channel and to find a home here in the UK, which is still, fifth most wealthy nation in the world, fifth largest economy in the world. So it's, we've got some questions to ask about this, and we can look at how this is understood and what the role of media is in facilitating our understanding of the needs of insecure communities and the experiences that of people who are forced to flee from the places that they might otherwise call home. And it's the argument is that a sense of dignity needs to be at the heart of our media response. And how do we build that if our journalism, if our news reporting purely sees this as part of a antagonistic battle of ping pong between different political ideologies or interest groups, then we won't move on from this. We'll only ever feel defensive and threatened by this. Whereas if we can actually listen and understand the human stories of people who are caught in the migration process, then we'll have a better understanding of how to act and how to plan and how to consider what we should do and how we should do things. And our media has to play a very direct role in this, not fanning the flames though, but ensuring that there is social cohesion, and social cohesion is based on mutual understanding, and sometimes that gets displaced, which is an important challenge. So the citizens' radio model, if you like, which looks at giving a voice to people who are at the margins, who are insecure, and who are kind of the least able to articulate and gain access to resources, is something that we should be paying a lot of attention to. So the cheapness of broadcast radio, the readily availability of analog radio is something you can carry a small radio with you. It uses few batteries. We'll consider this in a moment about the relationship with digital media and the push towards digital platforms. There's still a benefit and a need to support analog legacy forms of broadcasting, because not everybody is established and secure within any state or any nation or any place. There are always people who are pushed to the margins and are dealing with insecurity. And it's not just a problem, if you like, of the developing world, but it's also a problem within the UK and the USA, where rising inequality is pushing many more people into poverty and destitution, and the use of food banks, the lack of access to cultural, educational resources, the insecurity and precariousness that now afflicts our lives for many people, means that we have to also plan a media response and a community media response that is accessible by everybody, not just those who are wealthy enough and secure enough to have a middle class home with nice possessions, plenty of power, access to the latest consumer goods. That's all very good and well for the market, but there are people that fellow citizens and people who aren't citizens but could potentially be productive citizens within our communities who need access and need representation and need information as much as anybody else. And so we have to think very carefully that we don't exclude people by default because we regard one form of communication as to be inherently better than another, when we would end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, so this indicates that idea of social dysfunction, even within the world's top economy, which proportionally affects people of color more than it affects, if you like, white Anglo-Saxon communities. You're more likely to be subject to criminal incarceration if you're black in America than any other, or Latino if you're any other group. So there's these issues aren't just about what we do in parts of Africa and parts of Asia, but they're also fundamental to what we do in developed nations as well. So across Europe, across the UK, across the USA as well. And so the idea is that community radio promotes or supports or enables social action. And that development, and we need to understand a little bit about what development means, which we'll cover in a future talk. But there's a focus on practical and locally relevant advice that leads to social improvement, social gain. And we use media as a way of ensuring that that's accessible and relevant to the community it serves. And it's an approach which is based on ways that, if you like, provide an alternative to mainstream professional and commercial practices. So you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be a professional in order to engage successfully with people in your community. You just kind of have to be, you have to be competent to a certain extent, but you have to resonate with the people that you are representing or helping to inform or helping to encourage or entertain, whatever motivates the need for communication. And this is something which is practiced throughout the world. And BBC Media Action, the BBC's international charity, has shifted to some extent in its model of doing this from its kind of, one of the accusations about BBC Media Action is as great as some of the BBC World Service action activities are, is that it can be a little bit top down and producer led, whereas that kind of grassroots DIY media is more relevant to what we're talking about.
Welcome to Bangladesh.
Welcome to Bangladesh.
Welcome to Bangladesh. Our country has nearly 160 million people.
পৃথিবীর দীর্ঘতম সমুদ্র সৈকত এবং সবচেয়ে বড় ম্যানগ্রোভ বন আমাদের দেশেই।
আমরা এমন দেশে থাকি ঘর থেকে বেড়াইলে আমার নদী।
বাংলাদেশের মাটি এত ভালো যে কোনো বীজ ফেললে অতি সহজে হয় এবং ফলন খুব ভালো হয়।
But every year, tens of thousands of people are forced to leave their homes because of extreme weather. And when you rely on little income, even a small setback can have a huge effect. Amrai Pari means together we can do it. It's encouraging communities to prepare for disaster by working together. It started as a TV show,
Amrai Pari অনুষ্ঠানের আজকের পর্বে আপনাদের স্বাগত,
but has evolved into something much bigger. This time last year, Badol's potatoes would have gone to waste because he had no cheap way of storing them out of season. But Amrai Pari gave him the confidence to try this new technique. This is Mo. She follows Amrai Pari on Facebook and shared a music video about what to do in an earthquake. Lippy volunteers for the Bangladesh Red Crescent Society. She holds screenings of Amrai Pari in her community and talks about solutions demonstrated on the show. And this is Jyoti. He's developed a community radio show on disaster preparedness after receiving training from the Amrai Pari team. In 2012, BBC Media Action launched Climate Asia, the world's largest study of people's everyday experience of climate change.
I think a lot of the success of the show is that right from the start it was built on extensive research.
We asked more than 33,000 people across 7 countries in Asia about how climate change is affecting their lives. In Bangladesh, more than 82% people thought that changes in weather are making it more difficult for them to earn money. They are also worried about their health and about their children's future.
Whenever we design a new project, we do it with the audience at the heart of our planning, and we ask ourselves questions like, what are the issues that people are struggling with, who's most affected, what big changes need to happen, and what small changes can happen along the way. And importantly, how can media and communication help to bring about those changes? And the Climate Asia research gave us a lot of insight into these questions in Bangladesh.
So that idea that media is an essential part of development is really important, and something that we see supported by lots of NGOs, non-governmental organisations across the world that are using the resources that things like large media organisations like the BBC or Internews or the Australian broadcast charities engage in, because it's it's that age-old adage of you can give somebody a fish, or you can teach them to fish, and how do we use our media, and how do we teach people to create and share and use their own media? That's the important legacy implications of this. So the principles on which this is founded is the idea of which is brought together through UNESCO, which is the United Nations educational, scientific and cultural organization, which has for many years supported and promoted the idea of community media sustainability as a set of practices which are recognized and recognizable, and that are continually discussed and bring people together under the umbrella of a set of broad principles of media that is independent and which is run by and for the community that it serves. And this involves then capacity building, it involves training activities, and it includes empowerment through things like working with radio and through ICT now, social media communications now. And the idea is that this is a kind of a very an important way in which to build support for and to open up access to education, to self-expression and discussion, and to open up communication for people who are harder to reach or easier to ignore than other groups. So there's consideration for people who live in rural areas or away from centres of information, cities, which are centres of information circulation. But though even in cities, information doesn't circulate equally to everybody. And one of the things that UNESCO clearly has kind of founded these principles on is the sense of ownership that people have over the agenda that is being proffered by each of the media groups that are active, and it's about self-empowerment to express yourself publicly and to have ownership and control of that process of developing that, so that you play a role in the governance and the management of a community media organization. So these principles are discussed on a regular basis. It's independent, not for profit, and serves the community that is being represented. And you can find out more by looking at just Google search for UNESCO community media, and it brings up there's a whole load of really useful reports and toolkits that are outline what the kind of core principles are and the value of how community media helps to develop and offer a route into other sustainable social practices. So within the context of government and media regulation, it's if we're in a situation where we're not paying attention to community media, then we're also not paying attention to civic engagement and participation in the democratic process and economic participation. So it's if you like a bellwether for how fair and inclusive we are as a society. So these principles are independent, generally not for profit in nature, but independent of government or commercial forces. So here in the UK, community radio is a sector which is separate from the BBC, separate from the large commercial corporations, and separate from government as well, although there is some crossover in terms of broadcast license regulation, things like that. But community media doesn't have to go down that route. It can be entirely independent if it can develop a functional economic model for sustainability. But crucially, the governance is really important, is that it's owned and or managed by the community who participate in the decision-making process of what the station, what the program, what the project would be about and what it carries and how it works. And the consequence of those conversations are, the accountability is held with the people who the media service is designed to support and develop. So it's not distant from people. And then the service is that it's focused on issues of local concern that represent the interests of everyone in the community. So it's although we have a model in the UK which can be a bit exclusive at times, is that what it does is it represents certain underrepresented groups within the community, and it's essential that we do that. But we still, it's a patchwork. It's not, inclusivity, universality. They tend to be things which the BBC strives to achieve with its public service remit, whereas community media is more of a sort of phrase that comes to mind is like a bag of cats. It's lots of different groups and organizations pulling in lots of different directions for lots of different reasons. It's a patchwork, and that's its strength, rather than being something which is centrally managed and controlled by a corporate organization. So that fits with the kind of UNESCO principles, but that requires a different mindset and understanding from policy developers and public authorities and people who may want to work with community media practitioners and makers, because you have to understand that the motivation and the practices are different.
Remember who we are, our mission. Remember what we're fighting for, our goals. Remember what we hope to achieve, our actions. Together, every day.
My biggest priority for UNESCO is to make UNESCO more relevant, to make UNESCO more closer to what are the expectations from us.
The world is on the move, and we are moving with it. Together. UNESCO is you. Ensuring lifelong quality education and learning is essential for the eradication of poverty, reduction of infant mortality, establishment of gender equality, and the guarantee of long-term development, peace, and democracy. Together, we are taking action to promote literacy and education for all, which could change the lives of 1.5 billion children, youths, and adults. We are also supporting the efforts of 75 million teachers to provide quality education. The Annual Education for All Global Monitoring Report measures progress towards the Education for All goals, to which over 160 countries committed themselves in 2000. In the area of higher education, more than 650 UNESCO chairs and more than 68 networks have been created in 127 countries to promote research, training, and international cooperation. Together, we're working to safeguard and share our culture. We promote cultural diversity by safeguarding heritage in all its dimensions and in all its expressions.
Okay, so there's a wide ranging remit for UNESCO, but what we're interested in is the sustainable, what have been added since this video was clearly made, is the Sustainable Development Goals, which is something that we can cover in future discussions as well, although there's a link a little bit later on to that. So in the context that, UNESCO is one of the key facilitators of international community development, based on education, based on certain forms of human rights and the practice of economic democracy. So the Community Radio Handbook, which is produced by UNESCO, is a good, useful document to look at. And it talks about how community radio, for example, is seen as if you like, a mouthpiece for people who are marginalized or otherwise overlooked within the communications and democratic process. So it's the idea that citizens have the means to make their own views known on discussions that concern them. And this is aligned with the notion of good, transparent governance in public bodies, and that people who are in positions of public power are open to being questioned, and people can listen into that, and that the issues are given a good, kind of space to be aired, rather than merely being sandwiched into sound bites and short bite-sized chunks of information. Community media can really open up a conversation and discussion that is, looks at the kind of in greater depth the experience of people who are from underprivileged parts of our urban societies, our rural societies, and kind of develop a broader view of what the kind of relevant information is about those issues based on the experiences, the life skills that people have, the public interest that we have. And I keep repeating this, but it's community media really shouldn't be a platform for opinion. That you can do that on social media as much as you like, and there's plenty of it out there. Think about community media as a platform for experiences. So we all are expert in our own experiences, and bringing people together to share and to listen to each other's and to understand each other's experience, I think, is kind of one of the driving principles of community media.
Marking 50 years of partnership between UNESCO and Kenya, UNESCO brings an intellectual and humanistic response to global challenges of the 21st century through education, the sciences, culture, communication, and information. UNESCO is committed in realizing everyone's right to education and addressing literacy.
The Learning to Live Together program takes into consideration the spirituality of the participants that we work with.
UNESCO's 1976 General Conference held in Nairobi provided guiding principles and a global approach for promoting adult education. From preschool to higher and adult education, we are working to increase equal access to education that enhances knowledge development and life skills.
I think it's worth kind of noting at the moment is that the response to the pandemic here in the UK and maybe differently in other places, it'd be interesting to hear other people's views about this. Is that adult education is absent from our response, and that part of the future planning scenario for crises such as climate change and widening inequality and any future health pandemic that might happen really has to put at its heart of it an inclusive model of education and learning. We've reduced education to a kind of skills factory approach and something which you undertake in order for private gain, whereas actually we really need to be thinking about what the wider implications are of a de-skilled, de-educated population is that we will be unable to meet the future challenges that we are or maybe need to face. So media and is a development practice, and there's the adage that media is 90%, community media is 10% media and 90% community development, and that is really what our primary motivation and understanding of media in an international context is about, and how it can be applied locally here back in the UK is relevant. So as a set of development practices, we're talking about health and well-being, civil participation, deliberation, economic sustainability, environmental care, resilience. And to do that, we have to kind of prioritize education and learning, both formally and informally, which is culturally relevant. We have to encourage deliberation in a way which is civic, mutual conversations between neighbours and with the people who provide the resources to support our communities, our national and local governments. But also about representation, about how we project a sense of who we are, our sense of and understand a sense of who we are through our identity and the ability to kind of speak our truths and support uncomfortable conversations. So the kind of civic determination that's needed is kind of self-government and a community accountability. And that's a very different model of media than corporate public service media or commercial media, because it puts at the heart of this civic self-determination. And I think this idea that, kind of audience reach is enough to think about you're offering things to audiences actually has been demonstrated through the pandemic that it probably serves 60-70% of the population, but then you've got to reach the other 30%. It's that 80-20 rule, isn't it? Kind of, it's easy to reach 80% of people, but it's the 20% of people that you can't reach, or you're in the habit of ignoring, which are the people that you really need to have those conversations with, and 20% of that and 20% of that. So you've really got to kind of keep going into quite a rigorous process of examination and questioning about how these issues can be addressed and dealt with. And I think that's what we learn by looking at community media around the world and different models, and that there's a complementary role for media services that encourage people to understand and engage with different social needs around health, for example, hygiene, for example, family planning. The level of education of a population can't be assumed and relied upon if the institutions aren't accessible. And actually, we used to have a network here in the UK of adult education, which is kind of very much withered away since the 1970s. It's become quite narrow and is vastly underfunded. So let's use our community media to do that, because it's something that works in other parts of the world. And there's lots of examples about this, of where people are encouraged to exchange and share experiences through things like radio. You get a better sense of what's going on and how it works. And one of the strongest elements about promoting social change is identification with the people who have experienced those challenges and issues. If you listen to somebody who's talking about, changing in, how you bring up your young children, and you're listening to somebody like you who describes their experience, then that is a very powerful way of enabling people to make a shift and change in their own lives, because they can then buy into that idea that is being offered to them. They can take it up, or it's easier to take it up than somebody lecturing them, somebody coming in from outside of a community to tell you how it should be done. Should is a word that we need to is often banned from community media. You should do this, you should do that. It's like, well, let's look at what people actually do. And this is why it's so important to engage with international models of community media, because this tells us what it is that works in different cultures and environments for different reasons. So, you're able to influence and change public opinion and public behavior around issues to do with health, well-being, sanitation, all of these kind of important. We here in the West, to some extent, we take this for granted, but it's not. The level of access to resources is in many communities is a vastly reduced scale than it is maybe here. So one of the challenges is to think about how we can use media as an advocacy tool for change without, if you like, overtly campaigning, but bringing about development and social gain and social change in a cost-effective method that encourages and engages people in a way which helps them to feel some ownership over the process. So when you're introducing, I remember visiting Ghana a couple of years ago, and one of the big problems that the community radio station I visited was dealing with was public defecation, because in the homes that people had, which were often mud huts, would be a case that they would just wander into the forest to do their business, and the pressure of managing and changing that so that there's the integration of public latrines for public health benefits is best done through a community-led approach, rather than, if you like, outside agencies, NGOs, charities coming in, building things for people and then going away. We've seen a lot of that model in the past, and it's about skilling people up to tell their own stories. So we can look at this in terms of the toolkits that are available to us, and how we might build up and partnerships with organisations, charities, NGOs to help to equip people with the skills and knowledge and confidence to engage in the conversations about health and about well-being. And I worked on a project called A Germ's Journey through De Montfort University last year, which was about using community media as a way to engage people with the health and hygiene practices associated with germs transmission and effective ways to wash hands, that kind of stuff, which in many communities, in many places, and the direct experience of the project team working with people in parts, very, very poor areas in India, brought home the idea that this is, it's important to make these communication models relevant to people, and to do that you have to get buy-in from people to want to participate in that. So there's some good examples of how radio is used to address some of these problems. One of the things to remember about radio, and it'll figure quite a lot in radio as a model in this talk, although there are other growing areas of interest and access to things like social media, WhatsApp groups, YouTube videos, that kind of thing. And we'll look at that in future sessions. But one of the things about radio is that it's low skill, low literacy. You can be doing other things while you listen, and you don't have to be attentive to something in the way that you do with a visual media. So people who are not so confident with written words can and have visual literacies are able to engage with the ideas, because radio is this trusted and accessible form of media. And radio has a universality, if you like, because it can be typically broadcast. This is why I'm skeptical about digital media. Digital sets are quite expensive to operate. They use a lot of power, and they also use a lot more power to broadcast, and you have to manage them in a different way. Whereas analog radio, AM and FM, has a wider reach. It uses very well established technology, and handsets are cheap and available to people. So we give up on legacy forms of media at our peril, I think, because we want people to be engaging in conversations about social development, well-being, sustainability across all forms, or the whole range of our society. And that means that we also have to invest in the broader range of communications channels and initiatives and models that contribute to those development outcomes that we're looking to. So, it's kind of which way round is this? The platform for platform's sake is pointless. But if we think about what the needs are, the social needs are that we're trying to address, then the platform model is we use whatever works, we use whatever fits, and that will be different for different people in different contexts and situations. And the international model really tells us about that. So community radio community media just really uses media tools. And what we're trying to do is encourage and facilitate social change, but how that operates in practice, we can be open about creative, allowing different creative ways for that to happen, and take away the expectations that radio has to be done or media has to be done in a particular way, because the investment that we need in getting across ideas about change, engagement, understanding of for example HIV transmission works, has to be deeply rooted within the culture and the cognitive expectations of that community. And for people from the West to come in and try and instill that through a series of mass communications actions is doomed to fail, because it doesn't engage with people at a deeper rooted cultural level. So there's we can look to examples about how in different communities community radio has been used. And the interesting thing now about the democratization, the wider spread of practices is that for relatively low cost comparative to previous decades, it's possible to host and facilitate your own radio resources. At least you can make programs which can then be circulated and shared with other radio stations or other networks, so that you can send a link for a podcast, for example, via a WhatsApp group. So there's greater access. I mean, there's issues about how affordable data is, and this is one of the big challenges of why I'm skeptical about the push towards exclusively digital access, because broadcast radio is still relatively cheap, vastly cheaper than digital media is. And as I say, we just have to make sure that we're still doing each of these things and not just one of them. So I'm going to open the. Let's see. I've got the. There we go. So just drop. I've got to play.
RR hota.
RR hota.
Onarapunon RR hota.
অনরাফুনন আরার হতা এন অজ্ঞ প্রোগ্রাম যা অনরার জীবনরে সহজ করে দিবলাই তথ্য দেয়। আসসালামু আলাইকুম আম্বি আফা, কেন আছেন?
ওয়ালাইকুম আসসালাম আফা, আই বেশি ভালো নাই, কারণ আর সঙ্গে মায়াওয়ার হদ্দিন ধরে ফেরত সমস্যা এবং সাথে পাতলা পায়খানা।
So just a brief listen to the Ara Hota personal hygiene program. Local voices, local music, put together in a way, just very briefly listen to that, which kind of signals straight away that this is not, it's not, there's no synthesized whooshing sound design in this. This is a very DIY kind of in situ set of recordings. Rather, I mean, it's very, very well done. It's very smooth and very well edited. But the level of competence of editing doesn't have to be to that kind of westernized standard of overproduced sound design. We getting people to sit around and have a conversation and put a microphone in front of them to capture that is probably the best way to do this. That's why I like listening to these kind of programs. So the challenge then is, which we've discussed about legacy versus digital media. I think really, we have to be very careful from a policy and a practice point of view, is that we give up on legacy media at our peril. Legacy broadcast, AM, FM, broadcast radio is still very cheap to produce, and sets are very cheap, relatively cheap to buy, and they consume much less power than digital devices. And any kind of digital device tends to need a data contract, which needs a bank account, which needs stable living accommodation. So you can see how the knock-on effect about access to information can exclude people, and people living in rural populations, or people in poverty living in urban communities in shanty towns, and which don't have running power and running water. It's clearly the push to digital, while it is attractive, is not the sole answer to our information and our public civic needs to communicate and develop information, because otherwise we're not going to reach those people who really need support and help and need to be empowered. So just to reiterate, these kind of community media is a development practice, and it uses media as part of the development practice. And I'd always argue that when we set up a development project, or we're thinking of a social engagement project, media has to be at the start of that project. It has to be at the heart of it. It can't be tagged on at the end. We can't sit there and have a project and then say, now how are we going to communicate this? You're doing it the wrong way. And to be inclusive and to bring people into the process and empower people and inspire people who are often excluded from the process means that we have to approach our media in a different way, and not just to see people as assets, but to see people as contributors and co-developers and part of the ecological and diversity setup in order to do to make our social engagement, social development practices sustainable, has a sustainable media model at the heart of it, as well as socially sustainable media model at the heart of it. And I think this is what international community media can demonstrate, that it's consistent with empowerment models of change. So it provides a framework, this is Jim Ive, which enables people to be part of the decision-making process and to take effective decisions using a needs-based perspective, and that it can enable people to define for themselves what their felt needs and aspirations are, which are often never given an opportunity to be expressed. So community is consistent with the idea of a reality which is based on relationships and the collective understanding of our indigenous worldviews, rather than it being something which is, again, the audience, the producer audience model, really needs to be put to rest. I think we need an empowerment model, a civic empowerment model. So community radio and community media as a development tool is something which historically is supported by the idea, the philosophy, if you like, of it's a medium that is used to give voice to the voiceless, and a mouthpiece of the oppressed people, or by communities that have not been served by conventional communication structures. So we're looking for an approach which develops at the grassroots and brings about positive change in a community's status, its conditions, its living conditions, and its environment. And it does that through the dissemination of information, by promoting cultural dialogue, and by encouraging debate through radio and using all of the techniques of interaction that radio now has, and through social media as well. So it's not just on, I'm not arguing that radio should only be broadcast as radio, but you've got to have a way in and way out of enabling people to participate, both directly as community media makers who contribute to the programs that are broadcast in community radio, but also to the people who listen, the listeners, the community of listeners who engage with the topics and the debates and the discussions. So this is about community radio is often considered about voice empowerment, and it has a notion of political empowerment, which is incorporated with a notion of gender equality, social empowerment, and we look to, we see how this is effective through issues of participation and decision making, having a recognition of the differential social status of different groups and different people, and recognizing that not everybody gets access to public discourse about policy development issues, and that some people are excluded. And then following on from that is the economic indicators, which demonstrate that those people who are typically or more likely to be marginalized or overlooked are those people who, and particularly it affects women, and it particularly affects people of from in the UK of ethnic minority backgrounds, but also the relationship, if you like, between the economic differences between the global north, as it's called, and the global south, and developing and developed communities. So it plays a role in articulating and transforming that through the notion of social empowerment, where people are encouraged to articulate and enable and share their concerns for themselves, and to think about how they take collective action, and that using radio in these contexts and these situations can help to feed the understanding of the process, if you like. So when we think about who drives change in a community, it's often there are often people who are the same old voices that get heard, and when you bring and enable access for other voices to be part of the discussion, then you start to realize how things may need to change, and how some issues which are maybe taboo within a community, or which are just ignored, suddenly start to get expressed, and giving people the confidence, inspiring people to have the confidence to discuss those kind of things, which would otherwise not be considered, is vital and a key role for community media. So we go back to the development principles, which are access, participation, and accountability, and the notion that we have to facilitate and support access to the platforms and the systems, so that as many people as possible can get into them. So that means don't make them high skill, don't make them obsessed with qualifications, deprofessionalize media access in order to make it accessible. And then what you've got to try and encourage is a sense of participation that recognizes the needs, the motivations of the people involved, and puts that into legitimizes it and says, no, there is there's some editorial accountability that needs to link with this, so that you're not just spouting opinions which can be ill-informed, but what you're actually doing is you're looking for ways to provide useful and a grounded information, so that people can make informed decisions and govern themselves in the process. As a good action aid guide of community radio for change, and I think one of the ideas of community radio is that don't do community radio if you're not interested in social change. There's an awful lot of radio which is if you like, happy with the way things are and can just repeat and regurgitate, what we've acquired. And that's very nice. It's part of the process. But we've got to think about, well, where do we want to push things in the future? How do things need to change? Where are we often, we should celebrate the success and the things that are well established within our communities, but we should never take our eye off those things which are in need of action and are in need of change, and those people who are in need of support, and to reduce the number of people who are overlooked in our conversations and discussions, bringing more people in. So there's a lot of discussion and evidence about how international community radio media facilitates engagement internationally, and that it supports the ability of ordinary people to communicate with each other, and helps promote democracy and good governance in the process. So it's a well-established international model for this, and it is a separate form of media. It's well argued that community radio is part of a ecosystem, of a pluralistic ecosystem of public engagement. And while I would argue that it is vastly under resourced and has not been invested in, to the extent that public service media and commercial media have been allowed to prosper at many points over the last few decades, 50 years. Community media still has a kind of again a marginalized kind of approach, but it has an essential role to play in facilitating and supporting marginalized people who are at risk of social inequality and displacement, to still discuss and engage with issues that are of relevance to them. And we do this by facilitating a range of different ideas and practices based around primarily what makes something meaningful. And we will try and think about this in future sessions, future talks about what is a meaningful experience. It's a big question. We can maybe articulate what local experiences are, but the approach that we want to take is creative, and is facilitate active participation. So people have got to be involved in the process of production, the process of management of the service delivery, the development of the content, the development of the programs, and there is that they're in tune with and meet the needs and help to support the thinking about the future needs of a particular community, whether it's a location-based or an identity-based community. So you're kind of trying to produce something which fits a different set of rationale than a transactional model of media would otherwise allow you to do. And so this is tied in with the the notion of a development framework, which is that the fundamental purpose of communication radio is to recognize communication rights, to recognize social and political activism, mutual aid. Maybe this might veer into being big people politics, but local politics is often based on the response to practical things in a neighborhood and a community, and who gets to speak on those issues, who participates in the life of the community, and who has something to say about the development of that community and where it's going to go and where it's going to move forward. So there's what's called a community radio in this example by Backhouse from India, is that it's what's said is a liminal space, an in-between space where different kinds of ideas about community development interact, and that's useful because it helps us to look at different issues in different ways. So what community radio often is about is supporting civic society, We use community radio to encourage engagement, discussion, and deliberation. We use it to tell stories, which are based on the shared experiences and the shared needs, and exploring those needs. As I said earlier, about that's best done through an identification with the relevant people, the people who feel relevant and to us, and then we think about how we bring governments and public bodies into that discussion so that we're able to develop trust in public institutions as part of that two-way process of civic engagement. And a civic society, a functioning civic society, is something which is, it's a two-way process. There are associations, allegiances that are separate from purely the state-run bureaucratic approach and the market-led commercial approach, but it's some sit separately from that, and is about the established relationships that we have with one another, which we would, in some societies and some communities, there just isn't the resources to support that, and some communities are without the ability to have an engaged local, national, regional government model, and so they just don't have the resources or the experience. Whereas, in Western democracies, there's a lot more money available that can make deliberation and engagement part of the government process. But I'd always say that radio is a really great, effective way of doing that, and to play a role in that sense of civic engagement. It's quite vital. So civic society, community radio can play a part with civic society agencies, NGOs, voluntary sector groups, mutual aid groups, to come together as a kind of public engagement, learning organisations, research organisations, people who've got social action and meeting social needs as part of their core model of engagement. It's really important that, we, in a way, what community media has the potential to do is to sit as a public service media, certainly the BBC model of public service media, which I'm not sure how long that will be around for, is producer-led. It's quite top-down. It can be quite autocratic. But it's universal, and there's a service provided for everybody, and it provides core competence and basic information and education that needs to be underpinned in, and support for culture that needs to be underpinned across all of our communities. Then there's the commercial model, which is kind of what is facilitated in the marketplace, and you get what you pay for, and that isn't universal at all. It's very limited to those people who are either are willing to give something away in terms of their attention for advertising, or subscribe to a service. But in the middle, there's a kind of, if you like, a mutual potential for a mutual model, which is about bringing people together, organisations, community groups together, to work around the notion of public engagement, civic engagement, building civil society through community media, and to facilitate and support debate and conversation. And we see this as part of the model within international community media right across the world. And it's about the notion of, kind of facilitating and supporting community communication that help and support people to make effective decisions that affect them about the future needs and requirements of their community. And this can be something which is driven, helping people to articulate their views by giving them a microphone, and to share their thoughts, is a very, again, maybe we can talk about this in a future session about what goes on in that process, because you have to speak and other people have to listen. And then you get the opportunity to listen back to yourself. And that's a loop of reflection that I think is essential and leads to good development. So community radio is an established medium for expressing and sharing views, thoughts, ideas, problems. It addresses people who are in disadvantaged or vulnerable or hard to reach communities or social situations, because not everybody is part of a community. That's the idea of marginalization, that you're pushed out of community. But community radio has this way of opening up an arena and a space where people feel like they can be involved, because it doesn't need high levels of skill to get involved, and it doesn't need high levels of skill to listen. It just needs something that you can identify with, that is, kind of enables the process of community engagement and development. And crucially, I think one of the big benefits that comes from the community international UNESCO focused community radio model is that the way that it empowers women's groups in particular, because men are often in many communities and many societies, and we still see this here in the UK, there is a divide between accessibility and seniority and all those kind of things about who feels empowered to speak. And the more that we share and facilitate and inspire women to talk about their experiences, then maybe the more that we will see positive social change. And this is one of the lessons from the international models of community media. And it's really crucial that we have a counterbalance to the circulation of misinformation, disinformation, which kind of seeks to promote greater understanding based on the demands of information is not easy, and we shouldn't treat people because they're poor that they are stupid, and so we have to treat people with respect and with a high level of equality, an expectation that people can play a positive and productive role in bringing about sustainable change, whether that's in urban communities or rural communities, whether that's in developed nations or developing nations, and whether that's in situations where people have high levels of media literacy skills and places where people have low levels of media literacy skills. Everybody can play a role, and everybody has something that they can share about their experiences. And it's the remediation and the storytelling that we can look to and practice, and the experience that we can look to, which really what we can learn from and what we can learn about. So hopefully we kind of can use our community media techniques to help bring about some clarity. One of the crucial things about radio is that it's used in crisis communications because it can be cheap and effective. And again, it might be useful for us to look at this in a later conversation. But the idea that when we are natural disasters, famine, war, migration, there's displacement, there's all sorts of issues about how we get across information to people and in what language and in what way. Well, radio is relatively easy to manage in that respect, because it's voice based, doesn't need pictures. It just needs a microphone and a transmitter, and maybe a mixing desk in the middle, and then people who can articulate and speak to the issues that and put themselves in the position of the people who are listening, who have specific social needs in those situations, and to get information out very quickly. So as a model for crisis communications, again, there's a lot that can be learned from this. And hopefully the development practice leads to a more established sense of social and economic sustainability. And again, this is something that we can look at in more detail. I mean, each of these points really, it's something that we can spend many weeks discussing each of these points separately as well. So this is really just kind of flagging up some issues, and what we've got to think about is where value, wealth is put into communities, or whether it's extracted from communities. And at this point, it's clear that in many ways the media model is extractive, and it takes value out of communities and it doesn't put it back into communities. So I'd kind of like to see how the community radio, community media model is developed as a way of adding value to a community, rather than simply taking that wealth and value away from that community. So community radio has an important role to play in terms of economic development, and access to information, empowerment, even inspiring people to set up their own businesses and change their economic practices. We saw in the video earlier about the farming practices in Bangladesh, about responding to climate change. And, it's not necessarily about throwing money at things and doing things for people. It's about helping and supporting people to find solutions which are sustainable and which suit their local needs and requirements, and which can be carried on and practiced and developed over time, and that aren't subject to the flow of international capital on a large scale, but are embedded and rooted in the needs of that community, a sustainable economic model. And our media has to play a role in that and has to be part of that process. Otherwise, it won't be sustainable. Which brings us on to the again a topic for further conversation, really, which is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, and how the model of community media works across the range of the goals and plays a part in each, facilitating the achievement and the balance that is sought between each of these goals, so that we fit with an essential model of social development, rather than simply private development, private gain, private benefit, but we're looking to the broader principles of inclusive social sustainability. And that means serving different needs in different communities, whether it's rural, whether it's urban, and kind of looking at the kind of practices that people engage with, and the kind of languages that people's, and accents, and the stories that people tell that are relevant. So this is that think local, act global, think global, act local dynamic, really, or maybe a paradox in some ways, but it's a dynamic between kind of how do we shift and support people in a way which is relevant to their local needs, but also is sustainable on an international and global level, and what leads to sustainable behavior, what leads to the characteristics of a self-defined community, that when the NGO pulls out, goes away, finishes its project, and the volunteers and paid practitioners, support workers move on to their next project, that life carries on and that media continues to be produced within a community, rather than it just being something which is done for a short while and then left. And there's plenty of examples of how NGOs and charities and civic society groups often do that. They come into a community, and then when their money runs out, they move away. The project's finished, and everything goes back to kind of how it was before. So we really got to think in terms of what the changing ideas about attitudes, about beliefs and social norms, about social production of content and communications has to change itself as well. And a lot of this would be based around ideas of non-formal education, and the notion that it's okay to view education outside of institutions, and it's okay to look at tacit knowledge within a community, and to look at received knowledge within a community. Not always the practices that people have within their community are not always the best practices that are sustainable. But the solution to how we change to meet future needs has to come from those people operating in a community itself. And a lot of people don't want to engage in formal education or can't engage in formal education. So to come in and offer qualifications and certificates in that very Western model of education, in industrialized education these days, we're looking at folk and tacit and ad hoc grassroots bottom-up learning, and that should tie in, and it's a good model to tie in with community media and the approach that we need to take for community media as well. So just to summarize, and as I say, the notes and the links are all available on the MOOC, the Decentered Media MOOC, for this session. And so it's about participation. It's about the idea that we've got to get people involved and contributing and playing a role and being part of this, rather than maybe simply just listening and just receiving information, to get people producing information as well and producing stories and sharing their experiences. And Paulo Freire talks about, it's progressive education. And, we're looking for what gives people hope. The many obstacles that we face to social change, thinking about what brings about social hope is important. And so the importance of people deciding in a face-to-face way, which doesn't promote antagonism, suspicion of other people, resistance against other communities and identities, but enables people to kind of be open to those differences, but at the same time recognize that there is a human being associated with each of those, and not demonizing people and not mischaracterizing people. And community radio has that potential to be a tool in order to promote social engagement and diversity and inclusivity. I think really the idea that we use our media to share and celebrate, rather than as Kevin Howley talks about, rather than just trying to command and dominate, means that community media has a different kind of set of ideas that enable it to function, and that they cross boundaries, cultural boundaries and economic boundaries and national boundaries, and it has the potential to be a contributor to variation and diversity of cultural forms and practices wherever they take place around the world, and that we can look to them as a way of getting some sense of understanding of who we are as a family, a global family around the world. So that is the summary of this. Stop this share. Okay, so I've been talking for quite a while. You've probably pressed pause and come back at some point. That's good. The notes will be available on the MOOC, and the transcription I'll get done at some point and add them to the notes as well. If you've got any issues that you want to talk about, and you can use the forum, the Decentered Media Forum, to have a conversation about any of these issues. As I say, this is not perfect. This is needs kind of filtering, and it's just an introduction and a pointer into a number of different routes that we might consider, and the key principles that we might look at is to build up a sense of what community media from an international perspective is about. But thanks very much for paying attention to this, and I look forward to sitting down and recording and the next talk, which is going to offer just look at some general examples, not as long as this one, but just some general examples of community media that I think is of interest and could be of interest to get us started, to get us thinking about how we can do this stuff. That's what I'm aiming for. So stay safe and speak to you soon. You've been watching a Decentered Media Talk with me, Rob Watson. To find out more, go to decentered.co.uk or follow on Twitter and Instagram @decenteredmedia.